Good morning. The first question that we're going to discuss is the protagonist and antagonist of Candide by Voltaire. Now, I just want to preface this by saying that I didn't really like the book. I like Voltaire's philosophy, but I don't think he's a very good writer. But again, that's just my opinion. So, the protagonist is, of course, the main character, Candide, which means candid, which also means innocence. He's intentionally naive and very passive, which is really just the point of the whole entire novel. He isn't supposed to be developed all the way that you would typically see in a character, and this is to show how how someone would interpret something through all the different societies he enters. It's just Voltaire critiquing different institutions of the time, as of course this was written during the Enlightenment. Candide doesn't really drive the plot as much as Voltaire's reaction to it is, if that makes any sense. So this is the part where then you would be like, very interesting idea, Keira. I'm glad that you think that. And then you'd probably ask me a question or two, but I don't know, so we're just going to move past that. The antagonist. There's not a typical antagonist in Candide. More so, it's the institutions themselves, ranging from the idea of optimism, the folly of optimism, which we'll talk about later, to, of course, religion, war, social hierarchy. I'm trying to think. That's really it. So it's about Candide interacting with all of these different aspects of society, all these different institutions, and him realizing the bad in them. But more so, it's just Voltaire's own commentary being masked into a novel, which, again, I don't think he does a good job of doing that, and he should have just wrote a straight-up philosophy book instead of making it a novel. Reminds me of Sartre. He tried to write novels too, and they weren't very good. Sorry, I just don't like it. Setting and its significance. So the setting, there isn't one setting. The setting takes place again in many different places, but it's in the mid 18th century, which is the Enlightenment, and also Voltaire's lifetime. The Enlightenment, Voltaire's interpretation of Enlightenment emphasized reason, progress, philosophy, and different systems of government. And Voltaire specifically liked to critique the folly of optimism, which means that he did not believe that there was an ideal philosophy. Philosophy should not be as optimistic as it often was at that time. Geographically, the story is just the entire world. It's not just one place. He travels pretty much everywhere. He's in South America at some point, Europe. He's in Asia, I think, at one point. It's a lot. But this is all for Voltaire to point out the irony and the satire of different cultures and political systems, and to overall get to his thesis of sorts, that suffering and absurdity are just universal. They're what it should be. So the climax of the novel is when Candide finally rejects Pangloss's, am I saying that right? I don't know, philosophy of optimism. Again, the folly of optimism, especially after witnessing the suffering in Turkey. This is the first time that Candide stops trying to justify pain as some part of grand plan for something better, and he just sees it for what it is. This is some sort of character development, you could argue, for Candide, but I don't know. It seems more like just one giant rant of Voltaire rather than a novel. It's a turning point because Candide shifts from a passive acceptance to like action, to realizing what's really happening. He rather through searching for meaning through philosophy, he decides to live and just work, and that will eventually lead to him cultivating his garden. I really didn't like this book. I'm not sure why I finished it, but you know, I don't quit books halfway through. Significance of the title. Okay, I've already gone over this. Candide is candid, which means innocence, because of course Candide, the main character, is rather innocent. He's naive, he doesn't see the world for what it is, he believes in an optimistic philosophy, but it's also somehow like Voltaire the whole time critiquing institutions, even though Candide doesn't critique the institutions, and he just takes the world for like what he's told it is, until he doesn't. And we talked about that when he saw the suffering of the people in Turkey. He was like, that's it. And of course, like, Candide becomes an irony, because he's not innocent by the end of the book. Like, he's seen pretty much everything there is to see in the world. And so by like the last page where he's like, we must cultivate our garden, it's just irony at that point. Innocence. Like, when they talk about war, and like war is described, I think they use the term like ballerinas. It's just pure irony. So the novel contains like a lot of controversy. I already mentioned like religion. Voltaire, of course, is famously a critique of religion. Sorry, I got distracted. So does the book contain any controversial material or themes? If so, do you feel it added or subtracted to the book? Okay. Again, it's a satire. It critiques all the institutions that existed at the time. I think it added to the book. Again, that's kind of like its whole point, was the controversy of it all, was Voltaire going out there and saying these institutions need to be redone, and Candide, through his irony, sees how silly these institutions are. I think it's a little straightforward though, and a little bland. I think a novel to like there's tons of books out there that like critique institutions, and I think a lot of them do them in a bit more complex way than Voltaire did. What was my favorite passage from the book? Oh, as you would say, hi Keira, what was your favorite passage from the book? And I would say, we must cultivate our garden. It's the ending line, and I actually like that quote, because what it means is that we must focus on what we can control as humans. Like, we must focus on gardening, something that's practical, instead of this optimism, this ideal that we'll never really achieve. And that's what Candide eventually realized, is that he had to actually do something. He had to be active and take action instead of just believing in faith. Again, critique of religion. What was my favorite scene from the book? El Dorado. I really like that scene because it's just crazy how Voltaire described it and how perfect it was. I mean, I have a lot to say, but I didn't really like the book. I already mentioned that. The ironic part of that whole scene is that Candide wants to leave, even though like they found so much gold that they don't have like currency, and there's like no problems El Dorado, but Candide wants to leave, which is really silly to me. But the reason that Candide wants to leave, of course, is because Voltaire is making a comment about how humans don't really want perfection, and nor should they. Again, by the end, Candide realizes this, and his whole philosophy on life changes. Were there any parts in particular that you did not like? It was boring. It was really boring. Like, after the first few places that he visited, I was like, alright, here we go again. It's another institution, and here's his critique of it. I feel like it could have been shorter, and I feel like it could have just been like it didn't have to be a novel. I really don't think Candide, the character, was really necessary. But it was. Alright, themes. Okay, so the folly of optimism. Voltaire argues that optimism in philosophy is blind. He tries to show how it doesn't work when it intersects with real-life problems. Again, Candide goes from someone very optimistic. He gets kicked out of the castle in the beginning, right? And by the end, he's saying we must be practical, because he saw the world for what it was. He saw things such as suffering and war, and he also saw perfection, and he did not like either. So I guess that's a good comment by Voltaire about balance. Absurdity of war. I really like that part. So he describes war, like Candide does, as a beautiful dance, comparing them to ballerinas. It's one of my favorite shows of irony in the entire story, because like war is typically described as something horrifying or bad, but Candide describes it as something like a ballerina, and this of course is Voltaire trying to show how ridiculous it really is. Search for meaning. So meaning changes. Pangloss's optimism morphs into the idea that like suffering has a purpose. So again, it's that change that Candide went through. 1 to 2 symbols. So the garden. The garden is a rejection of all abstract philosophy. If I was going to write an essay, that's what I would center it around, is the rejection of abstract philosophy through like Candide's development. There's no fate or plan, but simply what we do and how we grow our garden. El Dorado. It's a major contrast. That's something else I could focus on. I could write the essay just all about that. It's a contrast. At first, it's like this ideal world that's perfect, but then it morphs into a point of clarity for Candide. In other words, it is a society so perfect that it's silly, that he no longer wants to stay there. So Voltaire, again, is a critique of optimism, saying idealism is ridiculous, as is other absurdities like war, but he classifies war as absurdity isn't absurd in itself. I guess I could argue. I wouldn't write about that though. Point of view. How would it be different? This was a tough question, but I talked about a third person point of view. It would be interesting to see it from a first person point of view, but that doesn't really give Voltaire the ability to go on as many like tangents. In that case, it might be more character focused, so it might seem more like a novel, which personally I would enjoy. Would I recommend this book to someone? And who? No, just no. It just wasn't very good. I mean, the concept was alright, it's just a little outdated. Like, I understand its historical significance, but it's a little bland, and there's too much philosophy in it to be a novel. Like, I don't like the balance of, like, the story of Candide developing, but half of the time it's just Voltaire talking about his own philosophy. It wasn't very interesting. What rating would I give this book? 3 out of 10. Harsh, but it wasn't good. And I've explained why. Was I supposed to answer all those questions?